I'm Andy Rich. I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership here at the City College of New York. And we are very pleased and privileged to be hosting former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, in about an hour in a conversation about global affairs and about his tenure at the United Nations, what's going on in the world today, and the path forward. We're honored to have this opportunity in large part because a team of people here at City College and at the Colin Powell School have been involved in organizing and publishing the former Secretary General's official papers. And we'll share news of that in today's event. And we'll recognize Professor Jean Krasno in particular, who's a longtime expert and authority on the United Nations and who has spent the last 6 years working with a whole team of folks around the world at the UN and particularly here at City College to put these papers together and to make them available to the world. So it's a great honor for us, and we look forward to hosting the Secretary General very soon.
It's nice to see you again. You're having a good trip?
Yes.
It's good. You haven't changed. It's impossible.
So, over the years, the subjects of this lecture have varied. Higher education, immigration, climate change and sustainability. Last year it was the civic health of this nation. This year, the topic is as important and timely as any we've ever discussed. International affairs and the role of the United Nations and international institutions. And our guest is the most distinguished we've ever hosted, Ban Ki-moon, the 8th Secretary General to the United Nations. This is a very special morning, and in a moment I'm going to turn it over to Tony List, the Provost of City College, to make introductions and to share greetings from the college. Before I do that, I want to extend a personal welcome as well to everyone here who is visiting City College for the first time today. I know that we have many distinguished visitors from the United Nations and from the missions to the UN. I want to welcome you, and I want to thank you for being here. You come to a place, to a college, and indeed to a room, this, the Great Hall, that have a wonderful history. CCNY was the first free academy in the United States. It was the first place in this country that lived out the belief that higher education is for all people. This week, as we mark the Colin Powell School's 9th anniversary, we celebrate the college's 175th anniversary. And as we begin our event today, it's worth noting that the idea of public higher education in the United States really began here, back in 1847. City College is a place that believes that higher education should be a democratizing force in our society, and that it is essential that for that democracy, that all people have access to higher education, and that a part of that education should be a discussion of national and international affairs. So that's what this college has always stood for. It's certainly at the heart of the mission of the Colin Powell School, and today's event continues that tradition. And in this very special room, the Great Hall, which was inaugurated more than a century ago by Mark Twain, and has hosted the likes of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, and of course, Colin Powell. It's fitting that we have the honor to host the Secretary General today. So welcome to everybody, including those of you who are watching us on the live stream, and it is now my pleasure to introduce Tony List, the Provost and the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at the City College of New York.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Colleagues, friends, distinguished guests, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you for joining us for the 8th Annual Sternberg Family Lecture in Public Scholarship. Today, the City College of New York has the rare privilege of hosting the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for a discussion of global affairs. As Dean Rich said, this is the 175th anniversary of the City College of New York. We're exceptionally proud of our legacy and our mission, and we are so happy to begin to be able to fill this hall with live human beings again after several years. Today's discussion has been made possible by the generous support of Cy and Laurie Sternberg. and longtime friends of City College. Sai is a proud CCNY graduate, a member of the Foundation for City College, and of the Board of Visitors of the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. The Sternberg Family Lecture has informed and inspired generations of students by giving them access to fascinating conversations about the urgent issues of our time. This year, the Sternbergs made a gift that will establish the Sternberg Family Professor of Leadership in the Colin Powell School. We are deeply grateful for your generosity and your belief in City College. Thank you, Sai and Lori. We speak so often of what the graduates of City College contribute to New York City. But today, thanks to the Secretary General's presence, is an opportunity to reflect on City College's place in the global conversation. For example, the State Department's diplomat in residence, who represents the tri-state area, is in residence at CCNY. The Charles B. Rangel Center for Public Service, which promotes the Rangel Fellowship and that expands and diversifies the Foreign Service, is in this very building.
And of course, one of our most famous graduates, remarkable Secretary of State Colin Powell, who gave back to this institution by developing the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. He was an inspiring presence on this campus, and we miss him dearly. It's a privilege for us to reflect today on the tenure of one of the most prominent international figures at a time of profound global change and challenge. We look forward to the Secretary General's insights into the responsibilities and duties of the leader of an organization that is, quoting from the UN website, the one place on earth where all the world's nations can gather together, discuss common problems, find shared solutions that benefit all of humanity.
Ban Ki-moon served as the United Nations 8th Secretary General, holding that role from 2007 to 2016. One of the Secretary General's first major initiatives was the 2007 Climate Change Summit, which placed the issue at the forefront of the global agenda and resonates strongly with much of what we do on this campus. At the time of his election as the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon was his country's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. His 37 years of service with the ministry included postings in New Delhi, Washington, D.C., and Vienna. In those years, he was responsible for portfolios covering foreign policy advisor to the President, Deputy Minister for Policy Planning, and Director General of American Affairs.
Work expanded over the years with assignments that included service as the Chairman of the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and Chef de Cabinet, head of office, during the Republic of Korea's 2001-2002 presidency of the UN General Assembly. Mr. Ban has also been actively involved in issues relating to inter-Korean relations. We're honored that our own Jean Krasno and our archivists at the CCNY Library have taken a leadership role in preserving the legacy of the Secretary General through the Papers Project.
Over the last 5 years, Jean and her team have painstakingly sifted through nearly 1 million documents affiliated with the Secretary General's tenure, culling them down to the most important representations of history and placing them online for worldwide access and use. When future writers and journalists and scholars research the years that Ban Ki-moon directed the UN, it will be this pool of information that they will inevitably draw from. For that, I thank Jean and her team for their accomplishment and their work. Today's talk will help us delve deeper into the role of the Secretary General, the scope of the Secretary General's work, and the overall climate of the international arena today. How do we make sense of today's events, given the outbreak of the horrible war in Europe again? How should controversial international policies like NATO expansion be approached? What were some of the most crucial highlights of the Secretary General's tenure? These are some of the many questions that we will tackle today. And so, without further ado, it's my distinct privilege to introduce the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. And I would like to invite Dean Rich back to the stage, who will be in conversation with the Secretary General.
Thank you all again for being with us today, and we're looking forward to a really robust conversation about global affairs, about the opportunities that the former Secretary General had in his time at the UN, and about the opportunities for young people, frankly, who are interested in public affairs. We're going to spend probably the next 30 minutes, 35 minutes in conversation up here, and then we will open it up for questions. So if you have questions, you'll have a chance to go to the mic in the middle of the room towards the end of the session and pose your question. So Mr. Secretary General, I want to start with current affairs, if I might, and perhaps the most high-profile and dangerous situation in the world right now, Ukraine. I understand that you are a member of the elders, and that you have the opportunity at times to continue to advise and support peace building around the world. And I wonder if you might reflect on what's going on in Ukraine right now, and where the UN factors into decision making.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrew Rich. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Provost Professor Tony Liz for your very kind introduction about me. And I also like to thank Cy and Lori Sternberg for your contribution, as well as for your support for this meeting could be possible. Thank you. I hope you will continue to support this kind of academic research activities. And I really appreciate all the distinguished professors and students who are here today. And I'd like to particularly recognize the presence of Ambassador Jo Hyun, who is now permanent representative to the United Nations. I thank you very much for your participation. Before I answer your question, just let me take just 2-3 minutes. I am deeply honored to be invited to this very important gathering. I know that Colin Powell, the late Colin Powell General, was, I think, student here. And he made a great contribution, not only to the United States, but to world peace and security and development. For me, personally, I have worked very closely with him as a counterpart. When he was the Secretary of State, I was Foreign Minister of Korea. Before that, he had been receiving a lot of admiration and love from Korean people. I often heard from him, among so many distinguished jobs he had held, then he was always speaking about how much proud he was having contributed to peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Particularly, twice, I think he served twice in Korea. Once as a battalion commander in Pocheon. That's quite near to demilitarized zone. Of course, he is a great statesman, great diplomat, and great soldier. Now, I am very glad to see that this City College of New York is now trying to honor his leadership and his commitment by having Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership. That's very nice and very proper, and I really appreciate you are taking such his leadership to inspire young students and motivate us to do much more to promote peace and security. As a former Secretary General, I didn't expect that he would leave us so early. It was 2020, September, when I and he was invited by the Korean Military Academy. Without knowing that he would leave just 1 year after that, before several hundred military cadets of Korean military cadets, I and he had spent at least 1.5 hour talking about the youth empowerment, peace and security of the international community, and peace and security of the Korean Peninsula, etc. So that he really inspired so many people, not only military cadets, but many Koreans who are watching through virtual means. I sincerely hope that we will really be inspired and motivated by his leadership. And I'm particularly counting on young students who will really be inspired and motivated by him. So with this brief introduction, I'd like to make some of my comments about your... before that, I'd like to particularly recognize Professor Jean Krasner. I think she's some... This morning, I had about an hour-long, meeting with her in my hotel. The collected papers of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, which was compiled and researched by Professor Jean Krasner. I was deeply touched, deeply grateful for her just a five-year-long research to have made all the documents in chronological, analytical way. I hope all this document, which is the result of tens of thousands of UN staff working together with me during my time as a Secretary General, will be usefully inspire and motivate the people. Again, I thank you very much, Professor Krasner, for your hard work and your contribution. Thank you very much. Now, let me answer your question. I think all the political leaders and citizens may have different views. But what is just not different, one clear answer would be that Russian aggression on Ukraine is totally not acceptable, and it is, it should be criticized as strong as possible way. I'm a member of the Elders. The Elders is a private organization. There are only 10 persons. This Elders was founded by Nelson Mandela about 12 years ago. It consists of former global leaders or Nobel Peace laureates. They have not been mandated by any organization. We are on our own, using and preaching and speaking out on our own moral authority. We have only moral authorities. We don't have any physical authorities. Once we used to have. They were the presidents, and I was the Secretary General of the United Nations. So at that time, we had something in our own hands. But at this time, we are using only our moral voice. As soon as this Ukrainian aggression happened, the Elders strongly criticized President Putin And we soon realized that when there were a lot of hue and cry and criticism that President Putin should be convicted as war criminals or genocide, etc., we realized that the international legal system is not perfect. There is not such a provision or legal background that he can be convicted as a crime of aggression. There is some legal background, when it comes to genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc. But when it comes to crime of aggression, the member states of the United Nations have been discussing this matter, but have not been able to agree on that. That's one loophole now. The chief investigator of ICC, International Criminal Court, had already begun investigation. In the name of the elders, if there is not enough legal background, then we should establish a special criminal tribunal. Of course, it will take a long time. It can be vetoed by Russia again. So there is a limitation. That's what I really sympathize with my successor, Antonio Guterres, current Secretary General of the United Nations. There has been a lot of criticism and disappointment. What the United Nations has been doing, why United Nations is not able to take any firm action. I fully share your concern, but at this time, reality is reality. We have to face sharply and clearly, realistically, what is the limitation of the United Nations, what are the limitations of the big powers like the United States and the European Union. But one thing is clear, this kind of aggression must be condemned and should be taken to international court, whatever it may be. In that regard, again, recently, the reform of the Security Council, reform of the United Nations have been also risen as quite serious issues at this time. I know that while working as a Secretary General, I have been receiving this kind of complaints and sort of some suggestions. Why don't you reform the Security Council? Why don't you reform the United Nations as a whole? That is what I feel very sorry that I do not have a clear answer to you today. But I'm sure that international community will not condone what has been happening at this time. There must be accountability about this. There must be justice process. That's what I expect. In that regard, you should take note that because we have been so much disappointed and frustrated by the use of veto power, regardless of what, the General Assembly of the United Nations held an emergency session and adopted a resolution by consensus that if and when the members of P5 use veto powers, then within 10 days, the General Assembly should discuss this matter, even though the General Assembly may not have any binding force. I'm sure that even though it may not have binding force, it will affect psychologically and politically big impact to the members of the P5. Whenever they use veto power, they may have to think twice. Now, international community may be more and more critical about this. This is my only hope at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the former Secretary General had a a memoir that came out last year, and if you haven't read it, I commend it to you. I've had the opportunity and privilege of reading it over the last week, and I was fascinated to learn about your childhood and about the ways that the UN factored into your life at a very early age as you grew up in a nation at war and in a nation that was, in a very positive way, affected by what the United Nations could make possible. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your youth, about your kind of realization about what the United Nations is and how it factored into your young life.
Korea was a child of the United Nations. When Korea was attacked in 1950 by North Korea and China joining, that it was the United Nations which sent 16 countries sent their soldiers, and 5 more countries sent humanitarian, like medical teams. Without United Nations, Korea would not be here today as it is, and I would not be speaking to you as I am now. So I was sort of child of war, but later I became a man of peace, and I am deeply grateful. You should understand that when the UN Security Council decided and recommended to dispatch military soldiers to deter North Korean aggression, I think that was the first and the last in the history of the United Nations. Then United Nations used enforcement power by the Security Council decision. Of course, there may be some misunderstanding between enforcement power and UN peacekeeping forces. At this time, there are 12 UN peacekeeping forces. During my time, there were 16 peacekeeping forces. But peacekeeping and peace enforcing are 2 different measures, 2 different systems. The United Nations has never been able to dispatch peace enforcing forces. It is normally done in the name of coalitions, whoever really wanted to join. So when it came to Afghanistan, Iraq, or Vietnam War, the United States organized a sort of coalitions. They were never been approved, supported by the United Nations. In that regard, Koreans, and we should be very much grateful. And we have been lucky in a sense. That's why it has changed my life as a Korean government officials, as a boy, growing up during extreme poverty and dangerous times, but I became much more conscious about peace and security, how this peace can affect the human lives. When there is a war, you cannot expect that you can have any freedom, or you can expect that your human rights can be protected. Just when I was 12 years old boy, at that time, there was an uprising in Hungary. I wrote a letter on behalf of my school friends, writing a letter to then Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. Mr. Secretary General, please help those young people who are being killed and beaten by Soviet Union. I didn't expect, exactly 50 years later, I would be standing on the same place where my long-term predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, would be standing. While making my acceptance speech, I appealed to the world I really hope, I sincerely hope that during my time as Secretary General, I would not receive such kind of letters of appeal from young people around the world. That was my humble and genuine wish. But during my time, 10 years as Secretary General, I have been receiving so many things. I have been dealing with so many conflict issues. Maybe the current issue of Ukraine, it may be regarded by historians that one of the most serious conflicts the United Nations and international community has not been able to deal with. So we have to learn the lessons from the past. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to correct a mistake I made as we began, which is we are joined by members of Secretary General's family, and I want to introduce Madam. Thank you very much. His wife is with us, and thank you very much for being here. And we're also joined by his son and his daughter. And it was a bit of a surprise reunion for the family. This is, I learned, the first time they've been together since the beginning of the pandemic. So we're glad that So staying on the thread of peace and security and the role of the United Nations in that, during your tenure as Secretary General, you had to contend with the Arab Spring. And I wonder if you could kind of reflect on that moment for us. How the Arab Spring presented a challenge to you at the United Nations and in your role, how you reacted, and what we learned from that moment.
Normally, we think that peace and security is the most important issues. Three pillars of the United Nations are peace and security, development, and human rights. They are three pillars of the UN Charter, but they are tightly interconnected. One cannot go alone on its own way. Of course, if there is no peace and security, you cannot engage in social and economic activities. Of course, your human rights cannot be guaranteed. There is abuse of human rights. At the same time, if economic situation, social situation is not stable, then there is no political leader who can maintain their political leadership. And economic activities cannot be done. They are interrelated. Now, when it comes to human rights, if suppose that there is a peace and security, there is a prosperous economic development, if your human rights are not protected, then it's just meaningless. In that regard, I've been always stating that upholding the human rights is the most important issue. But in reality, you cannot claim, I have a human rights when in front of the bayonet or guns. That's why the United Nations made it quite clear that justice is the most important process. I have been speaking out that justice will follow. There will be justice. If not now, if not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, sometime soon, justice will prevail. Those three pillars I have been speaking of. I have been really trying to uphold the three pillars of the United Nations. Of course, I have limited mandate, limited power, limited capacity, limited resources. That had to be supported by the member states, 193 member states, particularly countries like the United States. US support, US leadership, and global leadership has always been important source of keeping peace, making economic development, and keeping human rights. Those are something which I'm still believing. And in the end, when you really support and nurture the principles of the United Nations, I think we will be able to live in a better world where human rights are protected and where peace and security will be protected. Yeah. Thank you.
And can I ask you, with that as the mandate, when the Arab Spring happened and you were confronted with human rights abuses, civil conflict, and chemical weapons usage, the UN was forced to take action, to take a stand. And I wonder how you negotiated that for yourself and within the United Nations in order to be an effective actor.
I'm still feel regrettable that Arab Spring, which started from Tunisia in 2011, early 2011, has been stopped so soon without seeing all this realization of what we have been aspiring for. As you recall that this Arab Spring started from just a poor, powerless young man called Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia. He was beaten by police while trying to sell something on the street. He was a street vendor. Tunisian people rose against this one, against brutality of police. Seemingly starting with a very minor incident, brutality by a police has been spreading like wildfires across Middle East. Ben Ali, then president, had to run away from his country to Saudi Arabia, and this fire spread like wildfires to Iraq and Egypt and Libya and Syria. Unfortunately, this fire stopped at Syria because of the unconditional support by Russia, who was abusing the veto power. Not a single humanitarian support could have been delivered to Syrian people at that time. When there was credible evidence that the Syrians used chemical weapons, I immediately organized an investigation team. President Obama really wanted to bomb Syria using military powers. At that time, he was deterred by the Senate and Congress, American Congress. President Obama wanted to organize some joint actions, including European Union, United Kingdom. UK Prime Minister David Cameron was again deterred by his own parliament. That was there when Arab Spring just stopped. As much as to that, I felt very proud when I was able to speak out and I was able to work with the world leaders and Arab people. I visited Egypt. I strongly shouted out that Mubarak must step down immediately. Just 7 days after my such urging, he stepped down. I fought a lot with Gaddafi. Of course, he was very defiant, very much defiant. Would not listen to any advice of the United Nations. Finally, the United Nations, for the first time in the history of the United Nations, was able to use force, using NATO forces. I think that was the only time when Security Council was united, united, allowing to use military force to stop this unacceptable torture and oppression over their own people. Of course, Gaddafi was not killed by NATO forces. He was killed by his own people. But I still feel very much regret that United Nations could have not been done much. That's why Syrian people are still suffering. 6 million Syrians have become refugees somewhere in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. Those 4 countries are hosting millions of Syrian refugees. I myself visit all these refugee camps and trying to give the sense of hope. I've been always talking to them. Look, I was like you. I was also like yourself. I was a young boy, helpless, without any means to live. But now you have United Nations. So that was my constant message of hope to the people, particularly young people. But now I think the United Nations should do much more. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, more than 6 million people have become refugees. Much more than Syrian refugees who have been spreading, resettling in 4 countries. Now this is adding much more problems, much more difficulties and burden to the United Nations. Now we have more than 80 million refugees. Now, this number, 80 million refugees, are the ones only during the time of Second World War. We have that many number of refugees during Second World War. Seemingly, we are living in 21st century, where people should be able to live and enjoy the development of science and technologies, economy, and transportation and communications. Why then there should be so many people during the Second World War suffering? That's because of the leadership, lack of political leadership. The political leadership lacking global citizenship. They do not have any global vision. I am deeply sorry to say this one. During my time, 10 years as a Secretary General, I have not been able to meet many global leaders with global vision. At best, those leaders are national leaders. It's very hard to find the real global leaders with a global vision and global citizenship. I hope that young students here, you have to raise your voice. I think you have such a right and duty now. I don't have much hope, much expectation to the current leadership. It's only you, young people. You have to raise, challenge your president, challenge your senators, challenge even your professors. Tell them that, look, Mr. Senator, this is the world where we are going to live. Why don't you do your own work as a global citizen? This has been my continuous message.
I would like to pick up on that, the comment you just made about global citizens and global leadership. And I wonder, when you have found that around the globe, and particularly during your tenure at the United Nations, when you found global leaders, people who had the vision, the perspective, what did you find, I guess, over time to be the set of ingredients that could lead to them being able to have that broader vision and bigger vision and to join you in those conversations?
Global citizens are those who regard themselves as a citizen of the world. not necessarily belonging to a certain country or certain locality. But in reality, we may have to carry when you travel, when you cross over the border. You have to present your passport. I am citizen of Korea, I'm citizen of the United States. But this is merely just administrative issues at this time, in this 21st century, with the transformative development of science, technology, transportation, particularly communication. Whatever we discuss today now, it can be transmitted by a fraction of a second. So there is no such border. Borders are meaningless. When you believe, when you think you are belonging to this global world, then you are global citizen. When you think that I will do something only for my locality, then you can never be a global citizen. When I was just a high school boy, I was lucky enough to be invited by the American Red Cross. And at that time, there were about 140 young students. We were invited to the White House by then President John F. Kennedy. I was 18 years old. I was not even able to meet mayor of my own city, not to mention the president of Korea at that time. What a big difference. At that time, what President Kennedy said, political leaders are not getting along well, but you can get along well because you are young. National boundaries do not mean much. He said, exactly. National boundaries do not mean much. National boundaries were strictly established at that time. You could not cross the borders, particularly between East and West. At that time, I was deeply inspired by what he said. Of course, I could not understand fully what he meant. After having become Secretary General of the United Nations, dealing with so many world leaders, I realized what Kennedy said was a real meaning of global citizenship. So, immediately after my retirement from the United Nations, what I did first was establishing Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens. It's located in headquarters in Vienna, Austria. I am now still speaking out to young people that please have empathy. You may have passion, but there are not many people who do have true combined their passion with compassion, empathy. It's very important that you have empathy and compassion for others. It's your prerogative. It's only natural that young people have passion. But when you have only passion, you may not end up as a global citizen. This is what I'm speaking to you, to the students.
Thank you very much. And I want to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up for questions from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, I invite you to go to the microphone in the middle of the room, and we'll take questions there for about 15 minutes. My last question goes directly to an issue I know that's very much on the minds of many of our students and students around the world, and matters much to young people, and that's climate change. One of the things that you prioritized when you became Secretary General was a global climate agreement, and you were part of the Paris Accord. And I wonder if you might comment on what you encountered as you began as Secretary General, how you brokered an agreement, and how you think the world is doing on this front.
Still, I feel proud to have prioritized climate change, women's empowerment, and sustainable development goals, youth empowerment. Those are 3 or 4 areas I have really devoted my time and energy. And I was lucky enough to have been able to converse the political will of the world leaders. That's what we call Paris Climate Change Agreement. The decision-making process is very strange. Not a single country should not object. This was adopted by 195 state parties. At that time, if one country said no, this would not have been possible. Normally we are talking about majority rule or two-thirds rule, but this is 100 unanimity, absolute unanimity. In that regard, we were very lucky enough. Then have we done enough until now? I don't think so. I am angry by the lack of political will, by the lack of progress, by the big powers, including the United States. What did President Trump do? Metaphorically speaking, we are standing on the precipice of big changes. If we fall down under this precipice, then we have no hope. That's why I have been really raising my voice even after my retirement, all the times, that we must, first of all, raise the ambition level. Ambition level. I think it can be done. Normally political leaders, they are highly ambitious. But all this ambition has been used on other issues for their re-election or taking political leadership. But what is more important than political leadership is, I think, climate change. To make this humanity and planet Earth livable continuously for our succeeding generation. Why I'm speaking out like this way, the big countries, rich countries including the United States, have made big promises. First of all, they said that in 2009 in Copenhagen, we will provide every year $100 billion for those developing countries. Because developing countries, they are the least contributing countries to climate phenomena, as the United States, China, and European Union, industrialized countries, who have contributed much more to current level of greenhouse gas emissions, current level of climate crisis, but they have not done it. I expected that last year in November in Glasgow, the people would be united, but they were not able to have a firm agreement. They just passed the buck to, again, this year's Sharm el-Sheikh COP27. I have been really urging world leaders, unless we should contain the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, we will not have any hope. We will have to regret what will happen to our humanity, succeeding generation. We are not talking about only our or our children's generation. We are talking about millennia of years, a succeeding generation, so that our succeeding generation can live in peace, harmony, and safety. And our planet Earth is on fire, figuratively, literally. We have been experiencing unexpectedly strong, rainfalls, wildfires, temperature rising. This is not usual. This must be stopped. At least by 2050, we must make carbon neutrality zero by that. And we have to mobilize all political will. I think partnership, political will, mobilizing all necessary resources, that will be the answer this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.